welcome back to Books and Bikes. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today we're tackling a book that's, well, it's famous and infamous.
Yeah.
It's Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince,
Ooh, The
the
Prince.
16th century guide for rulers, and let's just say it's known for its pretty ruthless advice.
Definitely ruthless. But that's what makes it so fascinating, right?
Right.
I mean, Machiavelli wasn't just some armchair philosopher. He was living in Renaissance Italy. Think about it.
Yeah?
City-states constantly at war, backstabbing, alliances shifting like sand.
Sounds kind of like a real-life Game of Thrones.
Exactly. And The Prince was Machiavelli's guide to surviving in that kind of world.
So it was practical advice, not just theories.
Absolutely. He wanted to show rulers how to gain power and keep it, even if it meant bending the rules a bit.
Bending the rules, huh? That leads us to one of his most controversial ideas, realpolitik.
Realpolitik. The idea that morality takes a back seat to effectiveness in leadership?
So basically, forget good intentions, just get results.
In a nutshell, yes. It's the classic, the ends justify the means argument. Machiavelli believed that sometimes a ruler has to make tough choices, even if they're not ethically perfect, for the good of the state.
That's a hard one to swallow. Does that mean any action is acceptable as long as it achieves the desired outcome? Where do we draw the line?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Machiavelli doesn't really give us a clear-cut answer. He presents a pretty stark view of power, arguing that rulers can't afford to be naive or idealistic.
Meaning
They need to be prepared for betrayal, deception, even violence, and be ready to use those tactics themselves when necessary.
so it's all about being ruthless and powerful.
Not quite. Machiavelli also believed in the importance of appearances. He said a ruler should project an image of virtue, even if their actions aren't always, shall we say, squeaky clean.
So even back then, public image was everything.
Absolutely. And that's where Machiavelli's concept of virtue comes in.
Virtue. What's that?
It's not just about being a good person in the traditional sense. It's more about having skills, strength, cunning, the ability to seize opportunities and navigate challenges effectively.
So kind of like a leader's toolkit for success.
Exactly.
But is that all it takes? What about luck? Surely even the most skilled ruler needs a bit of that.
You're absolutely right. Machiavelli recognized that. He called it Fortuna.
Fortuna, like fortune.
Exactly. It represents the unpredictable nature of events, the twists and turns that can throw even the best-laid plans off course.
Makes sense. So a ruler needs both, Virtù to plan and Fortuna to hopefully make things go their way.
A winning combination.
Makes you wonder, does any of this still apply to leaders today?
Oh, absolutely. Think about any successful leader today. They likely have talent, drive, strategic thinking, their own version of virtue, but they also need the right circumstances, the right timing, a bit of luck to really make it big.
Interesting. Now let's get to one of Machiavelli's most infamous lines. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. Why would he say something so, well, cold-hearted?
It all goes back to his view of human nature. Machiavelli believed love is fickle. People change their minds easily. But fear, that's a much more primal emotion.
I see.
He argued that a ruler who inspires fear can maintain order and prevent rebellion much more effectively than one who relies solely on love.
But isn't there a difference between being respected and being a tyrant?
Of course. Machiavelli wasn't advocating for cruelty just for the sake of it. He believed that fear should be used strategically as a tool for control, not as a way to terrorize people.
So it's about finding the right balance. A ruler can't be a pushover, but can't rule by terror either.
Precisely.
This reminds me of another of Machiavelli's ideas, the analogy of the fox and the lion.
Ah, yes. He said a prince needs to be both, a cunning fox and a powerful lion.
Meaning?
The fox represents deception, outsmarting your opponents, while the lion symbolizes strength, using force when necessary.
So he's basically saying that sometimes a ruler has to get their hands dirty, maybe even bend the truth or break a promise if it's for the greater good.
That's one way to put it. It's a pretty controversial idea, even today.
It is. We value honesty and integrity, but Machiavelli forces us to think about those gray areas, those situations where those values might be tested.
Exactly. It's all about sparking that debate, that critical thinking.
It's amazing how a book written centuries ago can still be so relevant to the modern world.
It is, isn't it? The world might have changed, but the core questions about power, ethics, and leadership remain the same.
This book has been stirring up controversy for centuries.
Oh yeah, it's definitely left its mark on this book.
What's fascinating is how a book from the 1500s can still be so relevant and even controversial today.
It has been praised as a guide to leadership, but also condemned as a how-to for tyrants.
Sounds like people have really strong opinions about it.
They do, but the truth about the prince, like most things, is somewhere in between those extremes.
And Machiavelli himself, he wasn't just this, power-hungry guy.
Right, he was more than that.
He was a diplomat, a historian, even a poet and playwright.
Exactly. It's crucial to understand the context of his life to really grasp what he was getting at.
Yeah, what was going on back then that might have shaped his views?
Well, he lived through some seriously chaotic times.
Chaotic how?
Constant political upheaval in Italy, you know. He witnessed firsthand the dangers of weak leadership
Oh, I see.
and the devastating consequences when rulers couldn't adapt to all the changes happening around them.
So he was writing from experience, not just like some theoretical idea of how things should be.
Exactly. He wanted to give rulers practical advice, tools to help them survive and thrive in a really treacherous world,
And that world was.
full of power struggles. Machiavelli didn't shy away from the dark side of things. He knew there was a need for cunning, sometimes ruthlessness, when your rivals are always trying to outmaneuver you.
That brings us to something that always comes up with Machiavelli, this idea of Machiavellianism.
Oh yeah, that word has taken on a life of its own.
Yeah, it usually means someone who's manipulative, doing whatever it takes to get what they want, no matter who gets hurt.
Right, but is that a fair assessment of Machiavelli's ideas? Was he really saying it's okay to be completely amoral when it comes to leadership? It's complicated.
So what was he saying then?
Machiavelli believed morality has its limits, especially in politics.
So are you saying there are times when it's okay for leaders to break the rules? To do things that are morally wrong?
Well, he argued that sometimes rulers face choices that go against typical ethical norms, but these choices might be necessary for the sake of stability or security for everyone else.
That's a tough one.
It is, but it's important to remember Machiavelli wasn't exactly promoting tyranny.
So he wasn't saying go out and be a cruel dictator.
No, he actually emphasized that a ruler should avoid being hated, even if they need to inspire a healthy dose of fear to stay in power.
So it's all about finding that balance, projecting strength but not becoming a monster.
Right. Machiavelli understood that going overboard with brutality could backfire. It often leads to resentment and could even weaken a leader's grip on power.
That makes sense. So how does all this tie in with that idea we talked about earlier, virtù?
Good point. Machiavelli's virtù isn't just about brute force. It's about having the skills to navigate difficult situations, knowing then to adapt, outsmarting your opponents.
It sounds like you need a lot more than just the ability to intimidate people.
Exactly. And Machiavelli argued a ruler needs to be both lion and fox. Remember that analogy?
Oh yeah, the fox for being sly and the lion for raw power.
Yep. Machiavelli recognized that power is a game, and to win, you need more than just strength. Intelligence, strategy, and a willingness to bend the rules when necessary are all part of it.
Wow, so his view of power was really complex.
Very complex. And it definitely made people uncomfortable both back then and even now.
Yeah, he was challenging those conventional ideas about how leaders should behave.
Exactly. So over the centuries, the prince has had its fans and its critics, sometimes passionately so.
Who are some of the famous figures linked to Machiavelli's ideas?
Well, it's hard to say for sure who was directly inspired by him. Leaders don't usually go around advertising their sources.
Right.
But figures like Cesare Borgia, Henry VIII, even Catherine de' Medici have been associated with Machiavellian tactics.
Whether they read The Prince or not, their actions seem to fit the mold.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the word Machiavellian has become a kind of shorthand for a certain style of leadership.
Ruthless, pragmatic, getting things done no matter what.
Exactly. But the bigger question is, are Machiavelli's ideas still relevant today? I mean, it's a very different world now than it was back in the Renaissance.
Yeah, it is.
Well, while the specific examples in The Prince might seem outdated, the core principles he talks about are still surprisingly relevant.
How so?
He wrote about human nature, power dynamics, the art of leadership. Those things are timeless.
So even though we're not ruling kingdoms or leading armies, there's still something we can learn from Machiavelli in the 21st century.
Absolutely. The game of power might look different today, but it's still being played, just in different arenas. It's one of those books that really makes you think, even after you've finished it.
It really has. And, one thing that keeps coming back to me is how relevant Machiavelli's ideas feel, even though he wrote this, 500 years ago?
I know, right? It's almost like human nature and how we go after power. It hasn't really changed that much.
Yeah, it's a bit unsettling how accurate he was about people.
He understood that power can be a pretty seductive thing.
It can.
And that it can corrupt people, even those with good intentions.
Yeah, and he wasn't afraid to talk about the not-so-nice parts of how we behave.
Right, like people wanting to protect themselves, sometimes being willing to manipulate or lie to get ahead.
He was definitely a realist.
He was, but he also knew that you couldn't just be totally ruthless all the time. You needed to be practical and even think about your responsibilities to the people you're leading.
That tension between being ambitious and being ethical, that's what makes Machiavelli so fascinating.
Totally. He forces us to ask some tough questions about whether it's ever okay to bend the rules, even if it's for something we think is a good cause.
Yeah, there are no easy answers.
Exactly, and that's why it's important to really think about these questions both as individuals and as a society.
It's clear, though, that Machiavelli wasn't trying to give people a how-to guide on becoming a dictator.
Oh, definitely not. It was much more nuanced than that.
He was giving us a look at how power works in all its messiness and kind of pushing us to face those hard truths instead of ignoring them.
Right. The Prince isn't a how-to manual for tyranny. It's more like a mirror, showing us how ambition and the desire for power can play out.
So as we wrap up, what's the main message you think listeners should take away from The Prince?
I think the most important thing is to read it with a critical eye.
What do you mean?
Don't just take everything Machiavelli says as gospel truth. Question his ideas, think about where you agree or disagree, and then see how you can apply those insights to your own life and the world around you.
So use it as a way to understand how power works.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that power can be used for good or for bad, and then figuring out how we want to use our own influence in a way that aligns with our values.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on.
It has been a great discussion, really thought-provoking.
It has. And listeners, if you want to explore Machiavelli's The Prince for yourself, be sure to grab a copy from the link in the description. And don't forget to subscribe to Books and Bites for more deep dives into fascinating books and ideas.